Ahail Shi. Excellencies, distinguished heads of states and governments, esteemed heads of delegations, Secretary General, Mr. President, I would like to thank the President of the General Assembly on behalf of the people of Ireland for convening this meeting, provoking, as it does, some fundamental questions as to our very being as a United Nations. Is it not a profound condemnation of what we have made of the legacies of our cultures, reason, ethics, and belief systems, that we in these first decades of the 21st century live in a world that is home to so much war? Wars, the preparation for which absorb the finest minds in science and technology. Wars in which civilians are more at risk than ever before, subject to atrocities, famine and starvation, and to an unprecedented degree, displacement. Surely it is an affront to humanity that in these first decades of the 21st century, with all its promise, at a time when we have the capacity to abolish all forms of human poverty, we share a planet with hundreds of millions who are, even as we speak here today, deprived of their most fundamental rights, deprived of a dignified existence. Why have we resigned, I ask, to a politics of fear rather than to the promise of the politics of possibility? The Secretary General and the agencies of the United Nations will only be successful in pursuing our common objective of sustaining peace if we, the member states, do not recommit ourselves to those founding principles to which we dedicated ourselves so many years ago. And we must allow the new thinking and the new paradigms of critical thought we need to be allowed to emerge. If we are to truly commit ourselves to the objective of sustaining peace, we must discard any easy, lazy, or media cynicism. For example, the young of the world are appalled by the suggestion that what is normative can be for the General Assembly here, but that the strut of the powerful and the wielders of power can prevail in the Security Council. That is what is losing the young. Let us instead heed these lost hopes of all our collective paths. Those hopes pleased for wisdom that were the whispers from the gallery of the United Nations when so many of the newly free states brought their hopes, the hopes of their people, and the wisdom of the peoples, and the wisdom of their struggles to the United Nations. Let us once again in this hall recall the energy of that moral moment, the bravery, the critical scholarship, the hope which animated our forebears in their better moments, and devote ourselves to the cause of a universal peace, one that encompasses all of the people of our shared and vulnerable planet. Míle buíochas.
I also want to say about the American Irish Historical Society, where it was a privilege to speak here on interpreting Irishness and again on the Irish famine. And it's something you will be interested in about this, I think, as well, as representatives of Ireland communities. In the population of Ireland in the middle of the 19th century was over 8 million, about 8.45 million. And by the time we came to 1900, it had been reduced by 3 million. And 1 million deaths, another million immigration immediately, and then another million that had been simply displaced. But in 1901, more Irish-born people lived abroad than lived on the island of Ireland. There was the severity of our migration experience. The United Nations has no future if there is a rift between the General Assembly's moral intentions and the Security Council's outcomes. This doesn't mean it can be changed overnight. But the times we are living in at the present time now, it is not only that the strut of the powerful, as I put it this morning, defeats the moral instincts that are general in the General Assembly. It is what it means in relation, again, which I've tried to discuss this morning, about the intelligence and the science and technology that is now available to us that would enable us to do wonderful things, being absorbed in new militaristic exercises. Because the narrow theory of interest defeats the democratic impulse of us all in a humanitarian sense, is regularly being threatened. There are vested interests that stand to gain from, in fact, the defeat of the democratic inclusion of the United Nations, when in fact the Assembly's voice is being conveyed into the Security Council.
The birds they sang at the break of day. Start again. I heard them say, don't dwell on what has passed away, or what is yet to be. Ah, the wars will be fought again. The holy dove will be caught again. Bought and sold and born again. The dove is never free. Ring the bells that still can ring.
And as I've said in Irish, I say again, I speak in Irish. Very many people of the Irish were people who came to the United States in the 19th century, and very particularly in the tragic circumstances of the second half of the 19th century, spoke Irish as they came off the boats. And it's a privilege to be able to come to New York as President of Ireland and still be able to say that that language is alive and well. So míle buíochas as an fíorcin fóilte d'Irish of Romain, Reb ma van Céile Saivin, Níd a Toig Teasta Lum, agus an Terra Stan an Rialtas Catherine Sapone a Toig Teasta Lum. I'll now go into the other language which Irish America used in, but may I say how very important it is. When Sabina and I visit different parts of the Irish community in different parts of the world, and I very much define my presidency as a president of all of the Irish, wherever they may be. I think I've been speaking at the United Nations earlier this week, and I remind people when we're discussing migration that in 1901, more Irish-born people lived outside of the island of Ireland than lived on the island of Ireland. That tells another story. But I'm very privileged to be here this evening and to pay tribute to all of those who have worked so hard to make such an evening like this possible, and as you've just heard, we're being invited to continue and to bring it to its fullest fruition.
When he met her at the dance, she had flowers in her hair. There was no girl in this land who could have stood next to her there. And there everyone could see how he loved her instantly, though he had nothing to give her but his poor boy's hopes and dreams. Well, he danced with her that summer till it showed on her sweet face as she was taken by the warmth of him and all his gentle ways. And then he swore to her his love was true, and he married her in poor boy's shoes.
I have to say something about artists that I want to say, apart from the fact that my partner in life is somebody that I met at the Focus Theatre in Dublin. And that is, no one could possibly say the contribution that arts and culture make to our life. There are times when our feelings for empathy, for experiencing the depth of vulnerability, great joy, agony, and ecstasy of humanity are lost to us by the abuse of words. And we are reminded of what it was, what it is, and what it might be, and what it could possibly be by the work of artists who give of themselves again and again. And tonight you will hear people like Martin Hayes and Dennis Cahill and Declan O'Rourke and the wonderful Camille O'Sullivan. And one of the things whenever I hear, and I hear him often, Martin Hayes, one of the things that reminds me very, very much, at a time when the language had to be left aside to learn a new language to manage, to negotiate one's existence in a new space. The language, the music continued not just intact, but it went to the Appalachians and it went to the minorities, it went to the different places. And it crossed the Atlantic again and again and continues to do so. And on Radata an Nishnilcha one Crochiocht and Sauliacht, those two beautiful words in the Irish language, Crochiocht, which is creativity, Sauliacht, which is imagination. In the new arts centre that is going to replace a place that was kept alive over decades, and I pay tribute to those who kept the centre that from which I have just come, kept it going. I think it's going to be wonderful to realise that in the new building you will be able to see people and hear people doing what artists do best, achieving excellence, but not achieving excellence for something that is to be somehow or another metrically measured, but offering it to humanity to be able to recover the best of themselves. You mentioned earlier that I was at the United Nations earlier this week. I think that if there is one good piece of news that has come out of the Secretary General's report which we were discussing, is the references again and again and again to the importance of gender. Our world and the world that we're living in, very often, one of the great changes was that communications had made it possible for us to see famines that might have been ignored before. Why should we might ask, have to see them again and again? But usually on the consequences of the world's calamities, we see the images of women. We didn't see the images of women so often in the structures that were put in place to respond to conflict. We didn't see the work that outside of conflict altogether, the women who were responsible for most of the additional product that takes place in terrible conditions, let us say, across the continent of Africa. The good news this week was that it was clearly recognized that we lose as a society, we lose as a global economy, we lose as a viable source of humanity when we exclude women's contribution. We must all rejoice at the fact that gender equality was tackled in New York as a specific issue, but as a specific goal, goal number 5, which calls on the nations of the world to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. You know, goal number 5 is to be achieved by 2030. But I remember the response at the conference when I spoke on this in Istanbul at the Humanitarian Summit. And I said, what are we saying? Why should we have to wait a day or a year for the ending of violence against women? And I have used the opportunities I've had to also see something that is very important. I've just spoken about rights now. And yes, as I was introduced, I spent a great deal of time working on the intersected areas of culture and rights. But cultural practices must never be used as a shield or an obstacle to stand in the way of a woman's rights. On Tuesday, I addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations as part of a 2-day meeting held on the challenge of peace building and sustaining peace. The good news is that in the reports we discussed, a very specific repeated recognition of gender and a recognition of the importance of youth to achieve important issues like sustainability and an adequate response to climate change. And in preparing my remarks for that meeting, I recalled the declaration of solidarity that Dr. King made 51 years ago at Riverside Church. It is not 5 minutes walk from where we are today. For it was there that Dr. King drew together all the strands of the movement for civil rights and equality in this country. And he spoke of an enlarged solidarity with those who suffer injustice in other places. He was, of course, speaking of the Vietnam War. And how, when we think back on it, how can anyone think that they could ever have justified the bombing of Laos and Cambodia, non-participants in a war? And if I may quote Dr. King, there is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in that struggle. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, both black and white, through the poverty program. There were experiments of hopes and new beginnings. Then came the build-up in Vietnam, and I watched this program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything on a society gone mad at war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continue to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. These powerful words of Martin Luther King we must recall today in the first decades of the 21st century. We are still speaking of a society gone mad on war. The rhetoric, if you like, based on a politics of fear, it completely defeats discussions of a diplomatic kind that might respect complexity, and which appeared to be moving too slow. And yet, in the universities of the world, in the societies of the world, there are beautiful words in Irish for all of this. Our word for creativity is croíocht, and for our imagination it is saolaíocht. And there are in the dead languages, and ours as a living one, many, many times when people spoke about equivalent words. And there always is in humanity the possibility for creativity and innovation, and it is why Martin Luther King's rhetoric draws from an emancipatory tradition, a tradition of rights, but also a biblical tradition that was drawing on the prophetic and saying that as long as you breathe, you must be able to hope. Peace, as Dr. King may have reminded us, depends upon a recognition of a fundamental dependence and solidarity between us, upon our capacity for compassion and empathy and sympathy, and upon our shared commitment to institutions through which we may discern together the common good and unite behind collective endeavors. In the universities of Europe today, how many from the philosophy departments are advising the prime ministers or advising governments? How many in any part of the world? And what does this tell? Something interesting. It is as if metrics useful as a source of judgment have in fact displaced judgment itself, and beliefs on the narrowness of metrics have in fact displaced philosophy. And may I finish by recalling again the words of Dr. King when he said in his penultimate sermon, "We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. That mutuality and that solidarity demands that member states and the communities that support them remain authentic to the commitments that they made to their peoples and each other, particularly through those two landmark agreements of 2015. And it demands that we summon up again the same optimism that informed the United Nations in its founding moment, and the same vigor, energy, devotion, and idealism that Robert Kennedy brought to his campaign for peace in this country 50 years ago. Above all, it demands that same spirit of hope and righteousness that animated the students who sought to change not only a university or a city or a nation, but the world. And may they of a new generation, future generations, succeed in scholarship and practice, where often people such as myself have failed. And may they thus give meaning and authenticity to life and love itself. And may their world conform to the very best of their shared ethical, moral expectations in life for all of our global citizens.
Míle buchas, gramach, thanks.
There is a very old connection between Ireland and Latin America. It gets intense from the period about the middle of the 17th century on. And Irish people, after they had been excluded from participation, the fall of the Gaelic order in the first decades of the 17th century, went and served in the armies of the different European administrations and many of them made their way to South America. Many others then, after that period, identifying with the natural instinct and aspiration for republicanism and freedom of the people, they would become, for example, Florence McCarthy, who would have been the first adjutant general assistant of Simon Bolivar. And then you would have, in addition, the others, there were the people who in Mexico paid a huge price by changing sides, the San Patricio Brigade. And then you have others in relation. Daniel O'Connell, the liberator in Ireland, sent his son to work with Bolivar. And again, others from the Irish Republican movement sent people to work with different emancipatory tendencies in Latin America. That is a rich history. But it's something I say to Irish people regularly. It's something we should have made so much more of long before now, because the future is one where there are great opportunities for us in relation to cooperate together. when we were, I think just last year, when we were in Australia, in Perth, it was the first time Uachtaráin Cumann Lucas Gael and Uachtaráin Heron were present at the side of the pitch as we looked at the regional football and hurling finals. It was the first time, I think, that I saw those who had made it into the finals using the break to paint themselves with factor 50, which is quite unusual in Kerry and even in Kilkenny. Now, I think that what is very, very much, as well as that, we've had the opportunity over the years of visiting the GA facilities in Hurlingham and Buenos Aires, and I visited them more than once in London. And that's what is very important about Cumann Lucas Gael. It is a very, very important organisation. It is expanding all the time, with 400 clubs scattered abroad, now in every continent of the planet. But the most important thing I think about it all is an Oberjonach atar Carafal Shachten and Shachten the Yatsang Anuskamak Shansik Nadinioga, Chieta Stakar Cliffy is Sarkosigerak. It's those volunteers I want to pay tribute to, who make week after week make it possible for our games to be understood.
Gentil der fasta neang far when tirana when tra anok ahem savan.
As well as that, I think it is the clubs who are located outside of Ireland. The Gaelic, Éan O'Farrell and myself both spoke in Perth on that occasion, but we both said the same thing, that it isn't only the games themselves, it is the sense of Irishness, of staying in touch and being able to belong in two cultures, two traditions, two nations, without having to yield your connection with either. Is a family of the Irish wherever they are. And as President of Ireland, I want to express my gratitude to all those who have helped the Irish in any way, those who have enabled them to make the achievements that they have made, the very positive contributions that they are making, particularly in the public services of the United States. And I want to wish health and happiness to those of our Irish families abroad. And I am delighted for you. These facilities you deserve, and may you have many more, and may you flourish. Mille buicas es barbanach dan tawaki.